I still remember the sound that morning, the crunch of gravel, the roar of tires, and then that sickening snap. My private property sign lay split clean in half dust, rising behind a shiny white SUV with an HOA logo plastered on the door. Behind the wheel sat Claire Phillips, the self-declared queen of Whispering Pines, driving across my land like she owned the whole county. She didn't even slow down, just gave me that smug little wave through her tinted window, the kind that says, "You can't stop me." And right then something inside me cracked louder than that signpost. 15 years of hard work bulldozing this dirt road by hand, protecting every inch of my ranch gone under her tires like it was nothing. That was the exact moment I stopped being polite. If Claire wanted a shortcut across my land, then I was going to give her one. Straight down. Before we dig into this wild HOA story, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city and local time in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss how this showdown ends. If you've ever lived on a piece of land long enough, you start to feel every inch of it like it's part of your own skin. For me, that dirt road running from the highway down to my barn wasn't just a path, it was history. I'd spent 15 years keeping it alive. When the summer storms washed it out, I was the one out there at dawn with my old grader scraping, leveling, patching it up so the feed truck could make it through. That road was my artery, my pride, my peace. And for 15 years, not a soul disturbed it. Then she arrived. The new HOA subdivision popped up over the creek last year, one of those modern luxury communities that looks like somebody photocopied the same beige box 100 times and called it Progress. They named it Whispering Pines. I swear to God, there isn't a single pine tree within 3 miles. But that didn't stop people from paying good money to live there, and didn't stop Claire Phillips from making herself the self-appointed sheriff of suburban order. At first, I barely noticed her. I'd see the occasional car on the far ridge, maybe a golf cart wandering too close to my fence. But one morning there, it was a fresh set of tire tracks running right through the middle of my dirt road. I followed them down the stretch, and they ended where my property line met the HOA's back gate. I told myself it was a one-time mistake. Maybe some new resident got lost trying to find the main exit. Happens all the time. I even chuckled about it. But then it happened again, and again, and again. Every morning around 7:30 like clockwork, a white SUV with chrome trim would appear from the HOA side, kicking up a cloud of dust as it barreled straight across my road. Sometimes she'd slow down just enough to flash that fake friendly wave. Most days she didn't even bother. She'd blast music loud enough to spook the cattle roll through the intersection and disappear into the highway like she owned it. At first, I just stood there, bucket of feed and hand mouth open, watching her. You know that feeling when you can't believe someone's actually doing what you're seeing. It's like watching a squirrel rob a bird feeder in broad daylight, staring you right in the eyes while it does it. That's exactly what it felt like. So I did what any reasonable man would do. I put up a sign, big bold letters, private road, no trespassing. I planted it right in the middle of the curve, where she always passed through. Clean, simple, impossible to miss. The next morning the SUV rolled through again, and the sign was gone. I found it a few hours later, snapped clean in half, hidden behind my hay bales like a trophy. That's when I realized this wasn't ignorance. It was arrogance. That night, I was sitting on my porch watching the sun bleed out over the hills, and I saw the headlights again, bouncing, cutting across the field like 2 angry eyes. She didn't even slow down for the ruts, just sailed through a dust trail glittering in her wake. The next morning I decided to stop her. I parked my truck across the road near the bend and waited. Sure enough, 7:02 a.m., there she was. I waved both hands to get her attention. She slowed down, rolled the window halfway, and gave me that practiced smile the kind politicians use when they're about to lie to your face. "Morning, Mr. Rogers, is it?" she said. "Everything okay?" "Not really," I told her. "You're driving on private property. This road isn't public, it's mine." She tilted her head like I'd just told her the sky was green. "Oh, come on now. We're all neighbors, aren't we? What's a little dirt between friends?" That sentence burned into my brain. What's a little dirt between friends? I stood there speechless for a moment, trying to decide whether to laugh or yell. I managed neither. I just said, "Ma'am, this isn't a shortcut. It's a working ranch road. Please stop using it." She smiled wider. "Well, I'll see what the board says." And with that, she drove off, tires spinning, dust flying straight into my face. The board, as she called it, turned out to be the HOA counsel, a handful of retirees with clipboards and too much free time, all living under Claire's thumb. Over the next week, I noticed more of them showing up, stopping near my fence, pointing, whispering, measuring distances like they were planning an invasion. A few days later, I came home from the feed store to find something that made my blood run cold. Right at the mouth of my road stood Claire and 3 HOA members holding papers and sipping iced lattes like they were hosting a picnic. I slowed my truck, rolled down the window, and said, "Can I help you folks?" Claire smiled, that same porcelain smile. "Oh, Brandon, hi, we're just holding a quick community vote. The board decided it would be mutually beneficial to open your access road for neighborhood convenience. We're calling it a shared easement proposal." I laughed. I couldn't help it. I thought it was a joke. But then I saw her clipboard signatures, bullet points, HOA letterhead. That laughter turned to something else entirely. That night after I'd fed the horses and closed the barn, I walked to my mailbox. Inside was a letter, no county seal, no lawyer's mark. Just an HOA logo at the top printed in Comic Sans, for crying out loud. "Dear Mr. Rogers," it read, "the HOA board has officially voted to incorporate your ranch road as part of the Whispering Pines community travel access. Any resistance or obstruction will be treated as non-compliance with community guidelines. Cooperation is expected. Thank you for your understanding." It was signed, "Sincerely, Claire Phillips, President, Whispering Pines HOA," with a smiley face drawn next to her name, a smiley face. I sat there on the porch, letter in one hand, beer in the other, staring at that stretch of dirt road glowing under the moonlight. I could hear the crickets, the distant moo of a cow, and somewhere far off the faint hum of an HOA SUV idling like a threat. That's when it hit me. Claire didn't just want convenience, she wanted control. See, folks like her don't see land the way people like me do. To her, it's not soil or sweat, it's lines on a map she thinks she can redraw with enough votes and a confident tone. Well, I wasn't raised to bow to that. By the time I finished that beer, I'd made up my mind. No more warnings, no more signs, no more polite chats. If she wanted a shortcut through my life, I was about to give her one she'd never forget. The next morning, I picked up the phone and called Derek Miller, my oldest friend, and the only man I knew who owned a backhoe and an unlimited sense of humor. When he answered, all I said was, "Derek, you ever feel like teaching karma how to dig?" There was a pause then. His deep laugh crackled through the line. "Brandon," he said, "tell me when and how deep." And just like that, the seed of my revenge was planted. I looked out over the land again, the long, winding road that had carried me through every season, every storm, every bit of blood and sweat. It wasn't just dirt, it was mine. And if I had to dig a hole to remind someone of that, then so be it. There's a special kind of silence that comes before a storm, the kind that hums in your bones, warning you that something stupid is about to happen. For me, that silence came 2 days after the Comic Sans letter showed up. It was a Friday morning, and I was patching the fence near the creek when I heard voices, dozens of them, drifting across the wind. When I looked up, I saw a group of people standing right on my land, folding chairs, clipboards, balloons. At first, I thought maybe they were filming one of those overly cheerful HOA promotional videos, Whispering Pines where community thrives. But then I spotted Claire Phillips standing in the center like a general before battle, wearing a pink blazer and holding a megaphone. I wiped the sweat off my brow and muttered, "Oh, this ought to be good." As I got closer, I saw a folding table with a banner hanging across it. Community Access Vote, Making Progress Together. There were coffee cups, printed forms, and even a little donation jar labeled, "Help Pave Our Future, Morning." Brandon, Claire chirped as I approached. "Perfect timing, we're just about to start the vote." "The vote?" I asked, looking around. "On what exactly?" She smiled sweetly as if she were explaining something to a slow child. "On integrating your road as a shared access point. We're all neighbors here, and the HOA board believes community connectivity is essential for harmony." "Claire," I said slowly, "you're standing on private land." "Oh, don't be silly," she laughed. "The board already agreed this portion is part of the common easement. We're just finalizing it democratically." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A democratic vote to take my road. "You can't just vote on someone else's property," I said, half laughing, half fuming. She gave me that syrupy tone again. "Well, actually, Brandon, the HOA charter allows us to make recommendations that align with community needs. Once we file the motion with the county, it's just a matter of formality." "Formality," I repeated, staring at her like she'd grown a second head. "You think you can just declare ownership because it's convenient?" "Not ownership," she corrected, tapping her clipboard. "Integration." Behind her, a few HOA members nodded solemnly, sipping their coffees like they were witnessing a spiritual ceremony. That's when I knew Claire wasn't just delusional. She was dangerous. I told her plainly, "If you or anyone else sets foot on this road again without my say-so, you'll be trespassing, and the sheriff will hear about it." She smiled as if I'd complimented her outfit. "Oh, Brandon, you really should relax more. You're letting negativity cloud your energy." I took a deep breath and pointed toward the banner. "Take this circus off my property before I do it for you." There was a tense silence. the kind that hangs between lightning and thunder. Then she said softly, "You'll regret not cooperating with the community." I laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was the kind that comes from someone who's just realized they're living next to a lunatic. That night, the letter came. This one wasn't just printed on Comic Sans. It was color-coded, laminated, and signed with Claire's flourish and her little signature smiley face. Dear Mr. Rogers, the HOA Board of Whispering Pines has officially voted to integrate your private road into community use. Resistance will be considered a violation of regional community standards and may result in fines and legal action. Cooperation is expected and appreciated. Warmest regards, Claire Phillips, President Whispering Pines HOA. I couldn't decide what was worse, the delusion or the stationary choice. I crumpled it, then thought better, and smoothed it out again. Evidence, I reminded myself. You keep every piece of crazy. After that night, something shifted inside me. The part of me that used to believe in polite conversations and civil compromise, it died quietly, buried right there under the weight of that laminated letter. I started noticing everything. The HOA patrol cars driving by my fence just to monitor boundaries. The landscaper drones hovering too close to my property line. Even one of their so-called safety volunteers, jogging past with a GoPro strapped to his chest. They were watching me, testing me, waiting to see how far they could push. But they didn't know that I'd already made up my mind. It wasn't about anger anymore. It was about principle. If someone could take your property just by voting loud enough, what was the point of owning anything at all? That night, I called Derek Miller again. He was half asleep when he answered. "Tell me you didn't buy another cow," he mumbled. "No cows," I said, "but I've got a pest problem. Coyotes again, worse," I told him, "the kind that drive SUVs and file community motions." He was silent for a moment, then snorted. "Oh, you mean HOA varmints?" "Exactly. What's the plan?" I looked out the window at the moonlight glinting off the dusty road. Something educational, something humbling. The next morning, Derek showed up in his old Ford truck, a thermos of coffee in one hand and a grin that said, "This is going to be fun." "All right," he said, hopping out. "Tell me where you want the lesson dug." We walked the length of the road, studying the curves and slopes like two men planning a sculpture instead of revenge. Finally, I pointed to a spot halfway down the trail, right after a blind bend where the hill dipped slightly. "There," I said. "She hits that stretch doing at least 30. She'll never see it coming." Derek nodded approvingly. "How deep you thinking deep enough for reflection?" I said. He chuckled. "Got it. Philosophical trench. My specialty." We spent the rest of the day hauling out the old backhoe from his shed, greasing the joints, checking the hydraulics. The machine roared to life like a dragon awakening. By sundown, we had the first outline marked. The earth was dry, the air electric, with that scent of dust and heat that only Texas summers can make. Every scoop of dirt that came up felt like reclaiming a piece of pride I'd lost to Claire's tires. "Think she'll notice?" Derek asked, as the trench deepened. "Not until she's in it." We both laughed, the sound bouncing off the hills. We didn't stop until the moon rose high, pale, and perfect over the horizon. By then, the trench was 3 feet wide, nearly 4 deep enough to catch a heavy SUV, but not deep enough to do real harm. Just enough to make a point. We covered it carefully with old plywood packed dirt over it and scattered loose twigs and grass to make it look natural. From a distance, it was flawless, just another patch of country road. We stood there afterward, leaning on the backhoe, sipping cold beers and staring at our handiwork. "Looks like a work of art," Derek said proudly. "Modern rural installation," I agreed. "Tidal consequences of entitlement." He laughed so hard he nearly spilled his beer. Before heading home, we set up 2 trail cameras hidden in the brush just in case karma decided to perform on schedule. As I walked back to the house, the night air felt cooler, lighter. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't angry. I was calm, peaceful even. See, revenge doesn't always have to be loud. Sometimes it's quiet, precise, beautiful. The next day I woke before sunrise, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and pulled a couple of folding lawn chairs out by the barn. Derek showed up a few minutes later, donuts in hand, grin wide as ever. "You think today's the day?" he asked. "Oh, it's Friday," I said. "And Claire Phillips doesn't miss her Friday yoga class." We settled in behind a line of hay bales, cameras rolling, waiting. The sun crept higher, burning gold across the fields. The cows grazed. The wind was still. The world for once felt balanced, like nature itself was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, we heard it. That familiar roar of tires, the faint thump of bass, and the high-pitched voice of a woman yelling affirmations to a podcast host about manifesting her power. Claire Phillips was on her way. The sound of that SUV grew louder with every passing second, a deep mechanical growl mixed with pop music and entitlement. I swear I could almost smell the perfume and arrogance coming before I even saw the car. Derek nudged me from behind the hay bales, whispering, "Here comes the Queen of Asphalt." Through the shimmering heat waves, Claire's white HOA-issued SUV appeared over the hill sunlight, flashing off its chrome like a beacon of self-righteousness. She was right on schedule, yoga mat in the passenger seat, iced latte in the cup holder, sunglasses big enough to cover half her face. $10 says she's on speakerphone, Derek muttered. Make it 20, I said. And she's bragging. Sure enough, as she approached the curve, we heard her voice shouting into the phone about setting boundaries with people who don't understand community cooperation. The irony nearly made me choke on my coffee. The SUV hit the bend fast, too fast. She didn't slow down, not even for a second. The front tires rolled onto the plywood, the faintest creak echoing across the still air. Then came the sound I'd been waiting for. Crack. It was like thunder ripping through the valley. The plywood gave way beneath the weight of her 2-ton Suburban tank, and in an instant the front end plunged straight down. The SUV nosedived into the trench headlights, disappearing, the back tires lifting off the ground before slamming down again. A puff of dust and airbag powder exploded through the open driver's window. Claire's scream cut through the air, a high-pitched wail somewhere between shock and denial. The car's horn blared once, then died. Derek nearly fell off his chair laughing. I had to slap a hand over my mouth to keep quiet. From where we sat, the whole thing looked like a scene out of an action movie in slow motion, the world holding its breath as karma made its grand entrance. For a few glorious seconds, Claire just sat there, stunned, covered in airbag dust, frozen like a statue of poetic justice. Then, with a loud click, her door flew open. She stumbled out, clutching her phone like it was a weapon, screaming into the air. "Sabotage, you've put my life in danger. This is a criminal act." I nearly lost it when she tripped over her own yoga mat and dropped her iced latte into the trench. The splash of cold coffee across her shiny SUV was the final touch on the masterpiece. Derek whispered, "You think she's going to call the cops? She already has," I said, pointing. Claire was on the phone, pacing furiously, throwing her free hand in the air like she was conducting an invisible orchestra of outrage. Within 15 minutes, a county sheriff's cruiser pulled up. Sure enough, Sheriff Cole Matthews stepped out, a tall man in his late 50s, with a face permanently carved into "I've seen worse." He walked over, adjusting his hat, scanning the scene. "Morning, ma'am," he said slowly. "Everything all right here?" "All right," Claire shouted. "Do I look all right?" "This man set a trap. A trap. My car is destroyed. I could have died." Sheriff Cole looked at the trench, at the SUV, then at me and Derek standing behind our hay bales, trying to look innocent. He sighed, the kind of long, heavy sigh that only lawmen and parents of teenagers know. "Mr. Rogers," he said calmly, "you want to explain what's going on here?" I nodded. "Sure do, Sheriff." "That right there," I said, pointing at the trench, "is a soil erosion project. Been planning it for weeks. This here's private property, and she's been trespassing every day for months." Claire gasped like I'd accused her of witchcraft. "Erosion project. Don't insult my intelligence." "This was intentional. You can't just dig holes on a public road." Sheriff Cole raised an eyebrow. "Public road," he turned to me. "That true? No, sir," I said, pulling a folded county map from my back pocket, already laminated just in case. "Here's my property line. The road's been mine since 2009. Deeds on file at the clerk's office." Cole studied it, tracing the red boundary line with his finger. Then he looked at Claire. "Ma'am, this here's Rogers' land. You don't have legal access through it." Claire's jaw dropped. "That's ridiculous. We're all part of the same community." Cole nodded slowly. "Except he's not in your HOA. And unless your community charter overrules county property law, which I doubt, this road ain't yours." Derek snorted behind me. I elbowed him before he could say something stupid. Claire turned bright red, waving her phone around. "I demand an investigation. This is a violation of safety standards. He endangered me, my vehicle, and the integrity of the neighborhood." Cole pinched the bridge of his nose. "Ma'am, I'll file a report if you want. But from where I'm standing, it looks like you drove into an active work site that didn't belong to you. You're taking his side, I'm taking the law's side," he said firmly. There was a long silence. Then, in the calmest tone imaginable, Cole said, "You might want to call a tow truck." Claire looked like she might explode. "Oh, I will." "And you haven't heard the last of this, Sheriff?" He nodded. "Ma'am, I hope not. I could use the entertainment." Derek let out a wheezing laugh that turned into a cough. Claire spun on her heel, stomped back to her SUV, and tried to reverse, but the wheels only spun helplessly, flinging mud everywhere. One particularly wet clump splattered across her pink blazer. The look on her face priceless. Cole looked back at me with a faint smirk. "Nice ditch," he said quietly. "Mind if I borrow the idea for my driveway? Keeps the door-to-door salesman off." I grinned. "Be my guest." As he drove off, Claire stood by her half-buried SUV, fuming, shouting into her phone. The tow truck arrived 20 minutes later. The driver took one look at the scene, scratched his beard, and said, "Lady, this thing's not coming out without a crane." Claire's scream echoed across the fields again, loud enough to startle the cows. By the time the sun dipped low, her car was still half submerged, and she was still pacing. Derek and I watched the whole thing from the porch, drinking cold beer, barely able to breathe from laughing so hard. "Think she'll learn her lesson?" Derek asked. I stared at the trench, at the car, at the woman still waving her arms like a preacher mid-sermon. "No," I said, "but it's a start." That night, I walked out to the road under the full moon. The trench looked beautiful, a perfect scar on the earth, poetic and precise. I could still see the deep tire grooves where her SUV had gone under. The scent of oil, dirt, and victory hung in the air. I leaned against the fence post, smiling. "You brought this on yourself, Claire." Then I heard it faint at first, then clearer, the distant wail of another vehicle coming down the highway. The tow truck. "Guess we're not done yet," I muttered. Over the next hour, I watched them struggle. The tow driver sweating under the headlights, shouting instructions, while Claire barked orders like a general in pink armor. The winch strained. The chain clanged. The mud refused to let go. At one point, the tow truck's rear tires lifted an inch off the ground. The driver killed the engine, swore under his breath, and said, "Lady, this car ain't moving tonight. I'll be back in the morning with backup." Claire stared at him, horrified. "You're leaving it here," he shrugged. "Unless you got a helicopter handy." Derek, standing beside me, whispered, "You think she'll sleep out here with it?" I chuckled. "Wouldn't surprise me." We turned and walked back toward the house, the laughter still bubbling out of us like kids who'd just gotten away with something huge. But beneath the humor, there was a flicker of something deeper satisfaction. Not the mean kind, the righteous kind. The kind that comes from finally standing your ground and watching justice sink one tire at a time. As we reached the porch, Derek raised his beer. "To erosion control," he said with a grin. I clinked bottles with him, and to natural selection. The trench gleamed faintly under the moonlight, my silent declaration to the world, "This land is mine." The next morning, the smell of coffee filled the kitchen long before the sun made it over the ridge. I'd barely taken my first sip when I heard the faint grind of metal and shouting from down the road. Derek was already on the porch, arms crossed, watching the spectacle unfold like it was Saturday morning TV. "She's back," he said, grinning. Sure enough, down by the trench, the same tow truck from the night before had returned, this time with reinforcements. 2 more trucks, a crane rig, and about 5 men scratching their heads around Claire's half-buried SUV. The poor thing looked like a stranded whale, half covered in mud, its front bumper twisted and sagging. And there was Claire Phillips standing off to the side in yoga pants and combat boots, barking orders into her phone. Her pink blazer was gone, replaced with a Whispering Pines HOA windbreaker, like she was preparing for war. 3 trucks, Derek muttered, shaking his head. "I told you she'd double down instead of giving up." "That's her religion," I said. "She doesn't believe in defeat, just louder denial." We walked closer, pretending to check the fence line. Claire spotted us instantly. "Don't you even think about recording this," she yelled, waving a perfectly manicured finger. "This is an ongoing recovery operation, and you're legally obligated to stay 20 feet away." I lifted my coffee cup. "Morning, Claire. You left your car here overnight. I figured you were camping." Her jaw clenched so tight I heard it click. "You will regret this, Brandon Rogers. This is criminal negligence." "You dug that death trap on purpose, ma'am." One of the tow operators interrupted. "This trench looks engineered." "You sure this wasn't here before you drove through?" "Of course it wasn't," she snapped. "This lunatic built it to hurt me." The man gave me a look, the kind mechanics reserve for customers who argue with gravity. "Lady, I don't know what you did, but this ground's solid. You ain't getting this SUV out without lifting it." Claire stomped the mud with her boot. "Then lift it." So they did. The crane roared to life, chains rattled, mud flew. Every time the rig tightened, the car groaned like it was begging for mercy. For a brief moment, the front end began to rise. Then the rear wheels slipped, sending the whole setup jerking sideways. "Cut the tension, cut it," one of the workers shouted. The chain snapped loose, with a metallic whip that made everyone duck. Mud splattered across Claire's jacket. Derek choked back a laugh that sounded suspiciously like a cough. "Lady," the driver said, wiping his face, "this job's gonna need a full hydraulic lift or a damn miracle." Claire's response was another scream. Not a normal one, it came from somewhere primal, a mix of rage, humiliation, and disbelief. She hurled her phone into the mud, then immediately gasped like she'd thrown her own child. "Derek," I whispered, "you think we should tell her there's cameras watching all this?" "Absolutely not," he said. "You don't interrupt divine comedy." From the barn roof, the trail cameras blinked silently, two perfect little witnesses capturing every moment in crisp 4K. After an hour of chaos, the tow crew finally gave up. The lead guy tossed his gloves into the truck and said, "Ma'am, we'll come back after the ground dries. You're fighting Mother Nature right now, and she's winning." Claire stared at the SUV, chest heaving. Then she turned to me, her eyes narrow as a snake's. "Enjoy your little victory, Brandon. You think this is over. You have no idea who you're dealing with." I raised my mug again. Apparently a woman who can't read road signs. Her nostrils flared. "You're going to jail for this," I nodded politely. "Make sure to laminate the warrant. Keeps it from smudging." She stormed off toward the HOA gate, muttering something about lawyers and environmental hazards. As the trucks pulled away, Derek exhaled a long breath. "Well," he said, "that's the most entertainment I've had since my divorce." I laughed. And cheaper, too. But even as the laughter faded, a thought nagged at me. Claire wasn't the kind to lick her wounds quietly. She'd come back louder, more determined, armed with paperwork and poison charm. I knew I needed to be ready. By that evening, my suspicion proved right. When I checked the mailbox there, it was a glossy, full-color HOA envelope sealed with a gold emblem. I opened it carefully, half expecting glitter or venom to spill out. Inside was a letter titled, "Notice of Environmental Violation. Dear Mr. Rogers, the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association has received multiple complaints regarding hazardous environmental conditions created by unauthorized excavation activities adjacent to community boundaries. Your so-called erosion trench poses a risk to neighborhood safety and violates Section 4.2 of Regional Landscaping Ordinances. You are hereby fined $100 per day until the trench is filled and restored. Additionally, the HOA board has voted to demand immediate easement access through your road for community safety purposes. Failure to comply may result in legal action." It was signed, of course, Claire Phillips, HOA president, with her trademark smiley face below it. Derek read over my shoulder, snorted, and said, "She really thinks she's the county now." "Oh, it gets better," I said, flipping to the second page. "She's quoting ordinances that don't even exist. Section 4.2 refers to recycling bins." We both laughed so hard. Boomer, my old hound dog, started barking from the porch. Still, the letter was a warning shot. Claire was escalating, trying to bury me under paperwork where her SUV had failed. The next morning, things got weirder. A sleek gray Prius pulled up outside my gate, kicking up dust. A short, round man in a cheap suit stepped out, clutching a leather briefcase like it was a life preserver. "Good morning," he said nervously. "I'm Douglas Phillips, legal counsel for the Whispering Pines HOA." I raised an eyebrow. "Phillips, any relation?" He adjusted his crooked tie. "Cousin." "Of course," I said. He opened the briefcase with exaggerated care and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are official cease and desist orders. You've been served." I skimmed the top page. The grammar was worse than the Comic Sans letter. "Doug, you know this isn't valid, right? This road's mine. The trench is on my land. You don't have jurisdiction here." He cleared his throat. "Well, the HOA has certain shared." "Doug," I interrupted gently. "Do you even have a law degree?" He froze. "Working on it." "Community college." He nodded slowly. "Night classes. Thought so." I handed the papers back. "Tell Claire that if she wants to keep playing attorney, she should at least hire one who's past the bar, not the smoothie bar." Doug blinked, unsure whether to be offended or take notes. He mumbled something about reassessing legal frameworks, turned around, and immediately scraped the bumper of his Prius on a tree root while trying to leave. Derek leaned on the fence laughing until tears ran down his face. This is better than cable. But I wasn't laughing. Not entirely. Because if there's one thing I've learned about people like Claire, it's that they don't quit. They regroup. They recruit. And sooner or later, they find some loophole to exploit. That night, as I sat on the porch with Boomer's head resting on my boot, I stared out at the moonlit trench. The edges were crisp, the dirt perfectly dry. It looked less like a hole and more like a statement carved into the earth. Still, Derek's earlier words echoed in my mind. "She'll find something. These HOA types always do." I didn't sleep much that night. My brain kept turning over the same worry: old land deeds, old maps, forgotten easements. What if there was something buried in the paperwork that could give her a foothold? By dawn, I had my answer. I wasn't going to wait to find out. I grabbed my truck keys, packed a thermos of coffee, and headed straight for the county clerk's office. If Claire wanted a war, I was going to make sure I knew every inch of the battlefield. The county clerk's office was one of those buildings that smelled like old paper and slow time. Dust motes floated in the morning sunlight, cutting through the blinds, and somewhere behind the counter an ancient printer hummed like it was powered by spite and duct tape. I gave the clerk my best polite smile. "Morning, ma'am. I'm looking for all recorded easements and property agreements tied to Rogers Ranch parcel number 47B, bordering the Whispering Pines development." She looked at me over her bifocals, chewing on the end of a pen. "That the one with the HOA drama?" I blinked. "Already made the news. Small town, honey," she said, smirking. "Everybody's rooting for you. Give me a few minutes." She disappeared into the archives, leaving me at the counter with a steaming cup of clerk-brewed coffee and a lot of nervous thoughts. See, I wasn't worried about losing my land. I owned every inch of it fair and square. But paperwork has a funny way of biting you years later, one old signature, one buried clause, and suddenly your freedom becomes someone else's footpath. It took her 2 hours to bring it all out. File boxes stacked like dusty tombstones of bureaucracy. Deeds, surveys, plat maps, handwritten notes from the 70s, even a couple of faded Polaroids showing the land before the HOA ever existed. I spent the entire afternoon flipping pages, the smell of old ink mixing with coffee and tension. By the 5th binder, I found something that made my heart stop for a second. A document titled Easement Agreement, Whispering Pines Development 1976. I read every word twice, then once more for good measure. Turns out, when the developers first bought that land 50 years ago, they'd signed a very specific contract. It said that as a condition for construction, they were required to build their own access road to the main highway and explicitly barred from using or modifying any pre-existing private agricultural roads. In plain English, the HOA's shared access dream was dead before it started. There it was, in black ink and county seal. Valid, notarized, never revoked. I laughed out loud, an honest, belly-deep laugh that made the clerk poke her head out from the back room. "You okay out there, mister?" "Roger's better than okay," I said, holding the document up like a trophy. "You just saved a man from insanity." She grinned. "Good for you. Folks like that HOA lady could use a little lesson in boundaries." "Trust me," I said, sliding the papers into my bag. "She's about to get one laminated." I drove straight home, the wind whistling through the cracked window, that yellowed document sitting on the passenger seat like a holy relic. When I pulled into the driveway, Derek was out by the barn tightening a bolt on his backhoe. "Find anything?" he asked, wiping grease on his jeans. "Oh, I found something," I said, handing him the paper. He squinted at it. "Let me guess. Says she's not allowed within 10 miles of Sanity." "Close enough," I said. "Turns out, the developers signed away any right to touch this road decades ago. The HOA's been trespassing on a legal no-go zone since day one." Derek let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned." "You planning to frame that? Frame it? I'm gonna laminate it, make copies, and mail one to every HOA house with a Christmas card." We both burst out laughing. That afternoon, I decided it was time for a personal delivery. I tucked the laminated copy into a manila folder and drove down toward the Whispering Pines gate. There she was, Claire Phillips, standing by her mailbox in a pressed linen outfit, talking loudly on her phone about property rights and community vision. When she saw my truck, her smile faltered. I stepped out calm as a preacher on Sunday. "Morning, Claire." She straightened, voice dripping with sugar. "Mr. Rogers, I hope you've come to apologize for the destruction you caused." "Actually," I said, pulling the folder out, "I brought you something better. A little history lesson." I handed it to her. She took it with suspicion, flipping through the first page. Her lips moved silently as she read the title. Then her face froze. "What? What is this?" "The original easement contract," I said. "Signed in 1976. States that your development had to build its own road and couldn't use mine. Ever." She looked back at the page, like it might rewrite itself if she glared hard enough. "This can't be valid. This is ancient. It's notarized," I said, "and still legally binding. County confirmed it this morning." For 5 glorious seconds, Claire Phillips didn't speak. The wind rustled her papers. A lawn sprinkler clicked in the distance. Somewhere a bird chirped. Then she tried to crumple the page. Except it was laminated. The frustration on her face when the plastic wouldn't fold was so pure. I almost felt sorry for her. "Almost. Why are you like this?" she hissed. "You could have just shared. We could have been good neighbors." "Claire," I said softly, "you drove a tank through my property, tore down my signs, and threatened me with Comic Sans. We passed good neighbors about 6 months ago." She jabbed a finger at me. "This isn't over." "Maybe not," I said. "But your road trip sure is." I got back in my truck, leaving her standing there in the wind, clutching a piece of plastic justice she couldn't bend to her will. By the next morning, I had a real lawyer on my side. Mara Pritchard, a local attorney who'd been fighting land disputes since before Claire learned how to spell HOA. Her office was small but sharp, every certificate framed perfectly, every shelf organized with surgical precision. So she said, after reading the easement document, "You've got them dead to rights. This contract voids any claim they could possibly make." That's what I thought, I said, sipping her bitter office coffee. But I don't just want them to back off. I want them to stop harassing me for good. Mara leaned back in her chair, tapping the paper. Then we file a cease and desist, plus a civil suit for trespassing, property damage, and harassment. If they want to play legal games, we'll play chess. I smiled. You play chess. Better than they play law, she said. By noon, the paperwork was ready. She had it notarized, filed, and couriered within hours. Claire was officially on notice. 2 days later, Derek and I were fixing a fence when a county deputy pulled up in a dusty cruiser. He stepped out holding a stack of envelopes. "Delivery for a Miss Claire Phillips," he said. "Guess she's getting served." We followed him down the road just far enough to watch the show. Claire was in her front yard trimming bushes and pretending not to see him. When the deputy stopped and said, "Ma'am, these are for you," she froze mid-snip. "What is this?" she demanded. He handed over the papers with the kind of detached politeness only law enforcement can manage. Official notice from the county court. "You're being sued by Mr. Rogers." Her mouth fell open. "Sued for what? Harassment, trespassing, and property damage," he said matter-of-factly. "You'll find the details inside." Then, with perfect comedic timing, he tipped his hat and added, "Have a blessed day." Claire stood there trembling, the pink shears still in her hand. Then she screamed loud enough to scare off a flock of birds perched on the HOA sign. Derek whispered, "You think she's calling her cousin again? Oh, Doug's already printing out new Comic Sans." That night I sat on my porch watching the sunset spill orange light across the ranch. The trench glowed faintly in the distance, wildflowers starting to sprout along its edges. For the first time in months, the air felt peaceful. The land felt quiet. I wasn't naive. I knew Claire wouldn't go down easy. But this time I wasn't playing defense. I had the documents, the law, and a lawyer who didn't fold under pressure or laminate. And best of all, I had patience. The kind that waits and watches and smiles when karma shows up exactly on schedule. If you've ever been to a county courthouse in Texas, you know they all share the same smell: coffee, dust, and barely concealed irritation. By the time the clerk called Rogers versus Phillips, the place was half full of bored locals looking for entertainment. HOA drama was free theater, and apparently word had spread that today's performance starred Claire Phillips, queen of control herself. She arrived fashionably late, wearing a beige power suit and an expression that could curdle milk. Her cousin, the infamous Doug Phillips, HOA legal counsel, trailed behind her, juggling a stack of folders so thick it looked like he'd raided a Staples clearance bin. I stood at my table, calm as a man could be. Mara Pritchard sat beside me, every line of her navy suit sharp enough to draw blood. She had that look, the quiet, unbothered confidence of someone who'd buried bigger egos than this one. "Don't worry," she whispered. "She's about to talk herself into a loss." And she was right. The judge, a gray-haired man named Judge Holloway, who'd been on the bench longer than Claire had been alive, adjusted his glasses and looked at both sides. "All right," he said, voice gravelly. "Let's make this quick. Mr. Rogers, you're bringing a civil action for trespassing, property damage, and harassment, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mara said smoothly. "And Miss Phillips, you're countersuing for emotional distress, vehicular damage, and, he squinted at the paper loss of social standing. Claire straightened. "That's correct, Your Honor. I have been publicly humiliated, defamed, and physically endangered by Mr. Rogers's reckless and malicious construction of an illegal booby trap," the courtroom murmured. Someone in the back chuckled. Judge Holloway sighed. "Miss Phillips, you're alleging that the plaintiff built a booby trap." "Yes," she barked. "A hidden pit designed to destroy my vehicle." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, this isn't Home Alone. Do you have any evidence?" Doug puffed up his chest. "Your Honor, we have photographic documentation of the vehicle and witness statements confirming the trench's malicious intent." He shuffled through papers for a solid 30 seconds before dropping half of them on the floor. Mara leaned toward me and whispered, "He's an unlicensed amateur. Watch this." She rose from her seat. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, I'd like to submit a notarized easement document dated 1976, proving that the Whispering Pines HOA has no legal right of access to Mr. Rogers's road." She handed it to the bailiff. The judge scanned it for a moment, then nodded slowly. "This looks legitimate." Claire's face went red. That's ancient paperwork. It doesn't apply anymore, Mara smiled sweetly. Actually, Your Honor, it's still valid under County Code 19.4.1, unless Miss Phillips can provide evidence of a superseding agreement. Doug froze like a deer in headlights. We're still gathering documentation. The judge leaned back, unimpressed. Gather faster, son. Next, Mara called me to the stand. She guided me through my testimony, the daily trespassing, the broken signs, the Comic Sans letters. Every detail painted a picture of relentless harassment and absurdity. When she played the trail cam footage of Claire's SUV crashing nose first into the trench, the entire courtroom erupted in laughter. Even the bailiff covered his mouth. Claire slammed her fist on the table. That's illegal surveillance. The judge barely looked up. On private property, ma'am. Perfectly legal. Then came Doug's turn for cross-examination, or as I like to call it, the comedy set. He marched up with shaky confidence. Mr. Rogers, he said, pacing, would you say you enjoyed digging holes? The room went silent. I blinked. Excuse me, Holes, he said, louder, like repetition would make it less stupid. You seem to have an affinity for excavation. Mara coughed into her hand to hide a laugh. Sure, I said dryly. I dig a little now and then, mostly when the land needs it. Aha, Doug said, turning dramatically to the judge. You admit it. You dig holes, therefore you possess both motive and opportunity. Judge Holloway stared at him for a long, painful moment. Then he said, Son, are you trying to argue that owning a shovel is evidence of criminal intent? Doug deflated. Possibly. The judge sighed. Proceed if you can. Doug flipped through his papers desperately. Would you say your feelings toward the HOA are hostile? I shrugged. I'd say they're mutual. Someone in the gallery snorted so hard it echoed. The judge pounded his gavel once. Order. Actually, no, don't. That was funny. By the afternoon, Claire had spiraled from righteous fury into full-blown meltdown. She accused me of wiretapping her SUV, colluding with the sheriff, and psychological warfare through landscaping. Mara sat with her hands folded, letting Claire's monologue burn itself out. When the judge finally cut her off, you could have heard a pin drop. Miss Phillips, he said, voice calm but cold. Do you have any verifiable evidence that Mr. Rogers acted unlawfully? Her eyes darted. My word should be enough. It isn't, he replied. Not in this courtroom. He turned to me. Mr. Rogers, you've been patient through all this. Anything else you'd like to add? I pulled a folder from my bag, the laminated easement, the photos, the letters, the video stills of her tearing down my sign. Just these, Your Honor. Proof that every inch of this land is mine, and proof that she's ignored every warning I gave. The judge looked through them slowly, then set his glasses down. I've seen enough. He cleared his throat. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff, Mr. Rogers. The Whispering Pines HOA and Miss Phillips are ordered to pay damages for property destruction and harassment. Furthermore, the HOA will issue a formal written apology and is prohibited from accessing or modifying Mr. Rogers' land in any capacity. Claire gasped like a fish out of water. You can't do this. I'm the president of... Not anymore, the judge interrupted. Effective immediately, Miss. Phillips is removed from her position and barred from holding any HOA office for the next 10 years. Doug looked like he wanted to vanish into the floor. As the gavel fell, a wave of relief hit me like cool rain after a long drought. It was over legally, publicly, undeniably over. Claire, however, didn't take defeat gracefully. She stood shouted, "This is corruption," and stormed out, tripping over her oversized purse. The courtroom burst into laughter. Even Judge Holloway cracked a grin. Mara leaned toward me. Congratulations, Brandon. That was surgical. I smiled. You made it easy. Outside the sun was bright and hot. Reporters from the local paper were already waiting. Apparently Trenchgate had become a small-town legend. Derek showed up too, wearing a t-shirt he'd had custom-made overnight. Across the chest in bold letters it read, "Trenched by Claire." He handed me one. Figured you'd want the matching set. We stood on the courthouse steps grinning like idiots while the reporters snapped photos. By sundown, the clip of Claire being served, screaming at the deputy, yelling at a squirrel tripping over her purse, had hit 3 million views online. Comments poured in. Karma drives a tow truck. HOA equals hole of arrogance. Trench him, Brandon. I couldn't stop laughing. For the first time in months, my phone notifications weren't HOA threats, they were people cheering. But the best part wasn't the fame. It was the silence that followed. For weeks after the verdict, not a single HOA member came near my road. The trespassing stopped. The fake letters stopped. The peace returned, the kind that hums like wind through tall grass, gentle and deserved. When I asked Sheriff Cole if he'd heard from Claire, he chuckled. Last I heard, she's packing up her house. Says she's moving somewhere with more civilized neighbors. Florida, I guessed. Bingo. He paused, then added with a grin, "Y'all did good, Rogers. Not many people can say they won a war with an HOA. I smiled, looking out across my land. The trench gleamed in the distance, now filled with soft rainwater and a few wildflowers blooming along the rim. Maybe it wasn't just a hole. Maybe it was a monument, a reminder that some lines shouldn't be crossed, and if they are, you'd better be ready to fall in. A month after the courtroom circus ended, the ranch finally felt like itself again. Mornings were quiet. The only sounds were the low hum of bees drifting between the wildflowers and Boomer's lazy bark at the mail truck. For the first time in a long time, I could drink my coffee without wondering what fresh nonsense would land in my mailbox. Derek still came by most evenings. He'd moved into the old guest house behind the barn, said the quiet suited him, and the rent was unbeatable. Some nights we'd sit on the porch, beer bottles sweating on the railing, watching the sun sink behind the ridge where the trench lay. The wildflowers had taken it over now, a bright ring of yellow and purple wrapped around a dark scar of earth that once swallowed a queen-sized SUV whole. People still talked about it. Apparently the story had gone viral far beyond our little county. Someone uploaded the courtroom footage, spliced with the dash cam videos, and trail camera clips set it to dramatic music, called it HOA. Karen Meets the Trench of Justice. Within a week, it had 10 million views and counting. I didn't post it myself, but I wasn't about to complain. "Guess we're famous," Derek said one night, scrolling through his phone. "You've officially become a meme," I laughed. "What's the caption?" He read aloud. "When they say no trespassing, but you hear character development, we both lost it. But fame or not, the piece that followed was what mattered most." The HOA went quiet. Their new interim president, a mild-mannered retiree named Harold Jennings, reached out to me with something I never thought I'd hear from that community: an apology. He came by in person, hat in hand, and said, "Mr. Rogers, I just want to say we're sorry for all that foolishness. The new board's cutting ties with Claire's policies." I shook his hand. "Appreciated, Harold. You build your own road yet?" he chuckled. "Underway. The county approved it last week. Should have done it from the start. I wanted to be bitter, but the truth was, I didn't have it in me anymore. The fight was over. And in its place, I had my land, my peace, and something better. The quiet satisfaction of having stood my ground without losing my soul. Still, every now and then I'd get little reminders of the chaos that used to be. A tourist or two would drive out from town just to take pictures of the trench. Someone even listed it on Google Maps as Karen's Canyon. One afternoon, a couple pulled up in a rental car. The wife hopped out, camera in hand. "Excuse me," she said, "is this where the HOA lady's car went under?" I sighed, but smiled. "Yep, right there." She gasped, snapping photos like it was the Grand Canyon. Her husband nodded solemnly. "Beautiful. Justice in its natural habitat." After they left, I told Derek maybe we should charge admission. He grinned. "Or open a gift shop, t-shirts, mugs, maybe a shovel, keychain." "Don't tempt me," I said, though. The idea didn't sound half bad. Meanwhile, Claire Phillips had gone radio silent. Rumor was she sold her house in a hurry, packed up, and moved to Florida. Someone told me she joined another HOA down there, but within 3 weeks they'd voted to remove her for excessive correspondence. I can't lie, when I heard that I laughed harder than I had in months. Some people just can't learn humility unless it hits them at 40 miles an hour and lands in a ditch. As for Doug, her cousin/lawyer, he resurfaced once more, this time on Facebook, advertising his new service, Phillips & Associates HOA Legal Consulting Pending Certification. Mara sent me the post with nothing but a crying, laughing emoji. Speaking of Mara, she became a bit of a local hero, too. After winning the case, she gave a short interview to the paper, calling it a textbook example of how homeowners' rights often get steamrolled by misplaced authority. She even thanked the sheriff's department for upholding sanity in a world full of power-hungry suburban warriors. When I dropped by her office to thank her one last time, she shook my hand and said, "You'd be surprised how many people like you have called since that video went viral. I'm glad to inspire a movement," I joked. "Oh, it's a movement, all right," she said with a smirk. The Anti-Karen Coalition. Weeks turned into months. The new HOA road, the one they should have built years ago, finally got finished. It ran neat and straight-lined with fancy solar lights crossing just far enough from my property line that I could barely see it from the porch. On the day of their ribbon-cutting ceremony, I couldn't resist driving by. They'd set up balloons, folding chairs, and a big banner that read "New Beginnings." I parked at a distance out of sight and watched. Harold gave a modest speech about respecting boundaries and learning from past mistakes. The crowd clapped politely. No one mentioned Claire. No one needed to. When I got home that afternoon, I looked out at the trench again. The spring rains had filled it halfway, turning it into a small pond. Ducks had moved in real living proof that even the ugliest scars can grow something new if you let them. I grabbed a can of paint from the shed and a new metal sign I'd ordered online. I staked it right at the head of the road, gleaming in the sunlight. Private property trespassers will be trenched. Half warning, half joke. But around here, everyone knew better than to test which half I meant. That evening, Derek and I sat outside with Boomer at our feet, the smell of mesquite smoke drifting from the grill. The sky burned orange, fading into violet over the hills. "You ever think you'd end up famous for a hole in the ground?" Derek asked, sipping his beer. "Not in my wildest dreams," I said. "But if that's what it takes to teach people respect, I'll take it," he chuckled. "You ever miss the excitement?" "Not for a second," I said, leaning back. "Peace doesn't trend on social media, but it sure sleeps better." We clinked our bottles together, the kind of simple toast you give when you've earned your rest. And as the last light faded, I thought about everything that had happened. The signs, the trench, the courtroom, the laughter, the chaos, the quiet that came after. It struck me how fast small things can spiral, how one act of arrogance can set fire to an entire neighborhood, or how one act of courage can put it out. Claire Phillips fell into a literal hole that day, but the truth is she dug it herself long before. Every insult, every trespass, every smug wave out a tinted window, they all stacked up shovel by shovel until karma simply handed her the final scoop. Now that trench wasn't just a ditch in the dirt, it was a line, a reminder that respect is earned, not taken, that boundaries aren't walls, they're agreements, and if you break them long enough, eventually the ground gives way. Sometimes standing your ground doesn't mean shouting louder, it means holding steady when someone tries to push you off it. Whether it's an HOA president, a toxic coworker, or anyone who can't see the line between mine and yours, remember, calm persistence beats chaos every time. You don't need revenge that destroys, you need justice that lasts. And when it comes, it won't arrive with fireworks or applause. It'll come quietly like the sound of gravel settling after a storm, steady, final, and right. So, tell me in the comments, have you ever had a Claire Phillips in your life? Someone who couldn't take no for an answer. How did you handle it? And if you enjoyed this wild ride, hit subscribe, because next time, well, let's just say HOA might find out what happens when they mess with a rancher's water rights.